Changing the fuel injectors and cleaning the intake valves on a 2018 Honda Accord starts by opening the driver's door and pulling the hood release towards you. The hood release lever is located midline in front of the Honda emblem. Push the hood release lever to the left and lift the hood. Free the hood prop from its receiver and swing it into the passenger side receiver in the hood. Access to the intake valves and the fuel injectors requires the removal of the intake manifold located at the rear of the engine compartment near the passenger side here. We'll start by relieving the fuel pressure required for the fuel injector removal by locating and depressing the trunk compartment latch release button and open the trunk. On the false floor of the trunk, near the trunk door latch, there is a tether that needs pulled up to reveal several vehicle emergency items. Locate and remove the emergency fuel funnel. With the vehicle unlocked, push on the gas cap cover to release it, swing the door open, and push the emergency fuel funnel into the fuel fill receiver to open a small door to the fuel fill neck and ventilate tank pressure. Back at the engine compartment, on the driver's side, locate the fuse and relay compartment. The cover for the fuses and relays is easily removed by squeezing the 4 plastic latching tabs to the center of the cover and lifting upwards. To stop the flow of fuel to the engine, locate the PGM-FI main relay, which is blue in color and closest to the driver. Remove the PGM-FI main relay by gently jostling and lifting upwards. Take note of the pin orientation shown here with the 2 copper horizontal leads and the 2 silver vertical leads. Enter the vehicle with the key fob and start the vehicle. Allow it to idle until the engine is starved of fuel, cuts out on its own, and now has reduced fuel pressure in the fuel rail that will later be removed. Back at the engine compartment, minding the orientation of the PGM-FI main relay leads, press it back into place. Remove the emergency fuel funnel from the fuel fill receiver. Return it to its compartment in the trunk, lower the false floor back into place, and close the trunk door. Locate the car battery in front of the driver in the engine compartment. We'll want to remove this first. There are 3 10mm nuts that need to be loosened at these locations. Loosen, but do not remove, the nut securing the negative terminal. Gently jostle the negative terminal clamp to free it from the terminal and stow the wire behind the battery. Lift the positive terminal cover to reveal the 10mm nut that will need loosened but not removed. Jostle and lift the positive terminal clamp away from the battery terminal and stow it next to the battery. Loosen, but do not remove the 10mm nut on top of the J-hook that secures the battery harness in place. The hook should not be on the outside of the bracket as shown here. When reinstalling, I'll demonstrate how this should be properly installed. Once loosened sufficiently, twist and swing the J-hook out of its receiver and move the harness bar towards the front of the vehicle. Remove the battery from the engine compartment. Remove the tray that was under the battery. Locate, loosen, and remove this 10mm bolt securing the water bypass hose clamps to the intake feed pipe. These 2 10mm bolts secure the intake feed pipe to the engine. Loosen and remove both of these 10mm bolts. Free this vacuum tube from its clamp. For reference, here are the 2 bolts we just removed from the lower portion of the intake feed pipe. Locate the brake fluid fill reservoir near the driver here. Go to it, looking down at it from the vantage point of the engine firewall or windshield, you'll see these 2 hose clamps. These must be loosened with a flathead screwdriver or an 8mm socket with an extension. The socket is easiest. We can now free the intake manifold feed pipe from the intake throttle body. We'll need to deal with this cluster of wiring and hoses next, starting from the rear of this harness. There are 2 10mm bolts that need to be loosened and then removed. Those bolts we just removed were here. We'll remove this bolt using a 12mm socket. Remove this small vacuum hose from the top and rearward clamp. Depress both sides of this fastener connected to this corrugated plastic piping and push it through the metal receiver. Using needle nose pliers, squeeze this hose clamp and slide it upwards. With this metal bracket now loose, we're almost able to remove it, but we'll need to remove the hose we just shifted the clamp on. Using hose pliers, very carefully twist and gently pull on the hose to loosen its grip on the fitting on the intake manifold. Be careful not to damage the hose. Use a rounded pry tool to gently lift on all sides of the hose to avoid damaging the hose. Do not use a flathead screwdriver for this task as you risk a puncture. Remove the hose once adequately loosened. The metal bracket is now free of all obstructions, and we can remove it and the insulating foam pad underneath it. Back at the throttle body, remove the two hose clamps from the hose that connects the intake feed pipe and the throttle body. There are 4 10mm bolts on the throttle body that need removed, but first we'll remove the pony section of rubber hose from the throttle body. With that hose out of the way, here's a better look at the 10mm bolts on the throttle body. Remove all 4 bolts using a swivel socket or a normal socket. The normal socket was easier to use in my experience. The throttle body is now free from the intake manifold. Lift up on this plastic connector securing the fuel hose, rotate it to be horizontal, and then push it down to free it. On that same hose, locate the clip that secures it and push on this tab underneath while lifting to open it. Locate the green locking connector on the fuel hose and squeeze on both sides while pulling away to remove it. Stow the fuel hose out of the way. Locate this brown plastic connector holding the corrugated piping, pull the tab outward, and lift it up and away from its receiver. Next, we'll need to remove this electrical connector, depressing this tab and sliding it back. Squeeze and slide the hose clamp securing the PCV hose to the intake manifold. Using hose pliers, very carefully twist and gently pull on the PCV hose to loosen its grip on the fitting on the intake manifold. Be careful not to damage the hose. Use a rounded pry tool to gently lift on all sides of the hose to avoid damaging the hose. Do not use a flathead screwdriver for this task as you risk a puncture. Remove the hose once adequately loosened. Squeeze and back off the hose clamp affixed to this small vacuum hose. Gently lift and pry at the base of the hose until it releases. Squeeze the tabs on all 4 sides of this connector, securing the foam insulator while pushing lightly on it to release it. This plastic is very fragile, so be careful not to break it. Do the same on the connector to the left and peel the insulation foam back. Looking to the underside of the insulation foam, we'll want to locate these 2 circular tabs. These will need pulled on to release them from the fuel rail and the foam they hold in place. Lift and remove the insulation foam. Here is a close-up of the plastic clamps and pull tabs that hold the foam in place. Don't freak out if the circular pull tabs separate from the clamps. They clip back together. Looking at the manifold, loosen and remove this 10mm bolt near the corrugated tubing. Loosen and remove the center 12mm bolt affixing the intake manifold to the engine. Loosen and remove the far right 12mm nut holding the intake manifold to the engine. Remove the last 12mm nut on top of the manifold to the far left. Looking at the underside of the intake manifold, there are 2 more 12mm bolts that need removed. Take note of these channels where your socket extension will run. To the right of these 2 plastic tabs are the areas you'll need to place your socket wrench to loosen and remove both 12mm bolts. Gently jostle the intake manifold to free it from the engine and remove it from the engine compartment. Here's a brief look at the orange manifold gaskets that we'll begin to replace. Remove the intake manifold gasket that mates to the intake throttle body. Remove the 4 intake manifold gaskets that mate to the engine block. Fully douse the intake manifold with brake cleaner or manifold cleaner and wipe down all gunk inside the manifold, outside, and especially along the area where the replacement gaskets will be seated. Here's a look at the replacement gaskets model number 17105-5AA-004 for the oval gaskets and model number 17105-5 107-5AA-004 for the circular gasket. Insert the indexed circular gasket that mates to the throttle body. Press it into place in a circular motion, making sure it is fully seated. Do the same for the 4 indexed oval gaskets, and then we'll head back to the vehicle. Here's a look at the mating surface where the manifold sat on the engine. I'll address how to clean this off soon. We're going to clean the inside of the 4 engine intake ports. It's imperative that we locate which have the valves closed and which are open to avoid debris and cleaning solution from entering the detonation chamber while we clean. Currently, the left 3 valves are in the closed position and the far right is in the open position. This is what the inside looks like when the valve is closed, and this is what it looks like when the valve is open. I identified and captured both valve position videos with my iPhone while its camera light was on, so you can do it without a borescope if you're trying to save a few bucks. Spray intake cleaning solution into the ports and allow it to sit for at least 10 to 20 minutes. This is what it will look like after the solution is sprayed inside. Don't worry, the valves hold a seal preventing the fluid from draining, and if they don't, you have another problem to deal with. While we wait, spray the throttle body and wipe it down. One of the 3 most common ways to clean the intake ports is to use zip ties cut to length, placed in a cordless drill, and rotated to agitate the carbon buildup. To measure the required length of the zip ties, place them in the intake port and estimate an inch from the fuel rail and cut there. Method 2 uses manual picks by dragging and scraping them inside to loosen and then wipe away carbon with paper towels. These 2 methods, with repetition, will get you near this level of clean, but you can still see significant buildup around the edges of the intake valves. Before we use the 3rd method, plug up the intake port with the open valve. The 3rd method involves using a compressor, fine grit walnut blasting media, a shop vac, and an adapter to allow you to vacuum the spent media and blast the carbon accumulation with walnut media. I 3D printed my adapter to save a few bucks. I'll link a universal one below and the STL I used for the 3D print. As a note, I modified the original print, cutting off this base with a razor that did not fit the intake ports. This adjustment allows the print to sit flush with the surface of the engine and create a proper seal for the vacuum to remove a bulk of the walnut media. After blasting, use your compressor to blow out any residual walnut media. Here's a closer look at that taking place. Here's a look at an uncleaned intake port, and after a few rounds of scraping, spraying, wiping, and blasting, we get this. After placing a paper towel in our now cleaned intake port, spray the next intake port with cleaning solution, scrape it, and also take the time, if you haven't already, to lightly scrape and then wipe the gunk off the manifold to engine mating surface without marring the smooth face of the metal. Use the drill with zip strips, wipe down the intake port with towels, blast with walnut media, and clean with a compressor. Continue this process on all intakes with closed valves until you reach the last intake, which has an open valve. We'll now address that far right and open intake valve. We need to close it before we can clean. Looking straight down from the oil fill cap, we can see the crankshaft pulley and the bolt we'll need to turn. Place your 19mm wrench on the right hand side of the bolt and push it down, turning it clockwise. As this is turned, the intake valves will rise and create the seal we'll need when in the upmost position. With the intake valve now in the closed position, spray, scrape, drill, and blast until it looks clean. Place a paper towel in every intake to avoid getting any debris inside as we move on to remove the fuel injectors. Just above the alternator, we'll need to remove this bracket over the fuel rail and its pressure sensor, which is secured by 2 10mm bolts. Loosen and remove the 2 10mm bolts along with the bracket. Locate the fuel rail pressure sensor. We'll need to roll back the rubber housing covering it. On the underside of the sensor is a tab that we'll need to depress as we remove it from the fuel rail. On the opposite end of the fuel rail is a fitting on the fuel joint pipe, which must be loosened with a 19mm wrench, turning it clockwise towards the front of the vehicle. Before fully backing this off, lay down a towel under the fuel rail to catch fuel as we remove the rail and its components. Finish backing off the 19mm fitting on the end of the fuel rail. Loosen and remove the 6 10mm bolts and the 2 10mm nuts that secure the fuel rail to the engine. Near the throttle body is the other end of the fuel joint pipe, which also has a fitting that needs loosened with a 19mm wrench. Securing the fuel joint pipe is a small bracket and 10mm bolt. Loosen and remove the bolt. Now the fuel joint pipe and its insulating foam can be removed. Here's a look at where the fuel joint pipe was secured to the engine. Here is the fuel rail. With some persistence, wiggle, and very carefully pry evenly, making sure not to mar the engine surface to loosen and then remove the fuel rail from the engine. The fuel rail will leak gasoline, so be sure to capture as much fluid with your towel as possible. Wipe up any gasoline that was not caught by the towel. Depress the locking tabs on the fuel injector electrical connections and remove them from each one of the injectors. Here's a look at the fuel injectors with the electrical connections removed. With all injector wires removed, grab onto the fuel injector with a small pair of pliers and wiggle them while pulling outward to free them from the engine. Here's a look at where the fuel injectors were seated. Please make sure to wipe this area down. With our fuel joint pipe and 4 injectors now off the vehicle, remove the insulation foam from the old fuel joint pipe, pushing off the plastic clips holding it in place. Place the new fuel joint pipe into the insulation foam, pushing the plastic clips into place. Take a look at your new fuel injectors and inspect them, comparing them to the old fuel injectors. Once you're confident in the new injectors, lubricate the rubber seal of each injector with a very light coating of clean motor oil. Place each injector into the fuel rail. Install the new fuel injector clips that came with your order onto each injector as shown. You can do this while they are on the rail or before you install them into the rail. Make sure they are fully seated and secured. Please be sure to remove the plastic cover on each of the injectors just before installing it in the engine. Remove your gas-soaked towel from the engine compartment. Using the 2 screw studs as a guide, return the fuel rail and set it into position. Do not try to push these into a fully seated position. Return the 2 10mm nuts first and then hand tighten the remaining 6 10mm bolts. Using a 10mm socket wrench, evenly turn each bolt and nut 2 to 3 times, move on to the next bolt, and continue until they are tightened to 9 foot-pounds. Return all 4 electrical wires to the fuel injectors, which will click when seated properly. Double check to make sure these are secured. Apply the lubricant that came with the fuel joint pipe to the surface of the pipe that mates to the engine and fuel rail, and to the threads as indicated by the instructions that come with it. Place the fuel joint pipe into position. Secure the fuel joint pipe with the 10mm bolt to the engine while making sure both ends meet up to the ports that they must mate with here and here. Hand thread the top fitting. Hand thread the fitting for the fuel rail. Torque the 10mm bolt to 9 foot-pounds for the bolt securing the fuel joint pipe to the engine. Using a 19mm wrench, tighten the top fitting and then the fitting at the fuel rail. Return the fuel rail pressure sensor, pressing it into place with a click to confirm it's secure. Roll the rubber housing back over the connection. Return the bracket that covers the fuel rail and pressure sensor, tightening the 2 10mm bolts to 9 foot-pounds. Remove all the paper towels from the intake ports, and I'd recommend blowing them out one last time with the air compressor and performing a visual inspection for debris. Lower the intake manifold into place against the engine, situating it on the 2 threaded studs that are on the engine. Return and hand tighten the 2 12mm top nuts on the far right and far left of the intake manifold. Return and hand tighten the 12mm top center bolt on the intake manifold. Using these plastic mounting tabs as a reference point, to the right of it, insert the lower left 12mm bolt and hand tighten. Do the same for the right hand lower 12mm bolt. Torque all 5 intake manifold bolts and nuts to 18 foot-pounds. Double check that all bolts are torqued properly with a second pass on all of them. Move this assembly back into place over the manifold and return the 10mm bolt that secures it. I didn't find a torque spec for this bolt. Hand tight is fine, and be cautious not to over tighten it. Return the small vacuum hose by pressing it down over the piping and squeeze and slide its clamp back into place. Return the PCV valve hose to the piping and move the clamp to the base of the hose to secure it. Return this fuel hose to its receiver, push on the head of the hose to lock it in place, slide the hose into its receiver, and flip the plastic locking cover down to secure the hose. Return the white locking adapter onto the fuel line connection. Back to the area where the throttle body is located, place this insulating foam back into place. Minding these notches, place the metal mounting bracket into place. Here are those notches that need a line to meet up and properly seat this bracket. Place this 12mm bolt into the bracket and hand tighten. Return the two 10mm bolts at the rear of the bracket and tighten to 9 foot-pounds. Push the brown connector for the corrugated piping onto its mounting bracket. Tighten that 12mm bolt at the top of the bracket to 18 foot-pounds. With this hose secured into the clip above, slide it over the piping on the manifold and move the clamp to the base of the hose. We just finished installing the bracket here, and now we'll focus on the throttle body. Return the 4 bolts that secure the throttle body to the intake manifold and torque these to 9 foot-pounds. Here is a close-up of the throttle body with its 4 bolts. Return and fully seat the rubber hose that sits around the male fitting of the throttle body. Return the 2 hose clamps that secure the rubber hose to the fitting of the throttle body and make sure they are evenly spaced. Look for the indentation on the hose of where they previously sat for proper spacing. Return the intake manifold feed pipe into the rubber hose fitting on the intake manifold. Push these 2 hoses into their plastic clips on this mounting bracket and place the mounting bracket just over the receiver on the intake manifold feed pipe. Hand tighten the 10mm bolt between the hose bracket and the intake manifold feed pipe. At the opposite end of the intake manifold feed pipe, towards the front of the vehicle, locate the mounting area where the 2 10mm bolts must be returned. Do so and torque these to 9 foot-pounds. Return this hose back to this clip. Hand tighten the hose bracket on the intake manifold feed pipe to avoid breaking it. Return to the 2 hose clamps that secure the intake manifold feed pipe and the throttle body, and tighten these with an 8mm socket until there is no movement or chance of the feed pipe becoming dislodged. Be careful tightening here as well to avoid breaking the intake feed pipe plastic and to maintain proper hose clamp spacing. Return this small floating hose clamp near the brake fluid reservoir joining the 2 hoses. Return the insulating foam to the underside of the intake manifold, pushing the top clips into their receivers and the lower clips onto the fuel rail pipe. Return the battery tray. Return the battery with the negative terminal closest to the passenger compartment and the positive terminal towards the front of the vehicle. Return the negative battery terminal cable. Secure it into place with a 10mm socket. Return the battery securing arm into place. Swing the J-hook into place on the inside of the bracket. Tighten the battery securing arm using a 10mm socket. Apply the obligatory "that ain't going anywhere" dad tug on the battery to confirm it's properly secured. Return the positive battery cable over the battery terminal. Secure the positive terminal cable with a 10mm socket and close the positive terminal cover. Return to the interior of the vehicle and start the engine in a well-ventilated area. The vehicle will pressurize the fuel system and start after fuel is delivered to the injectors and combustion chamber. If the battery is out of the vehicle long enough, you will likely see this prompt that systems are initializing. Take the vehicle for a drive after allowing the engine to come up to temperature, ideally with 4 coolant temperature bars shown. The anti-theft system will likely need reset by pressing and holding the radio power button for 2 seconds. The TPMS tire pressure monitoring system may also need a reset. I have a video for this procedure and will link it in the video description below. That's it. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and please consider supporting my channel through the links below.